Thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I'd just like to say that I think that this area of human interaction with the environment through mobile devices is absolutely essential and very timely. And I'm certainly very, very keen that Q can be involved in these discussions going forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about Q, just to give you a very brief introduction to Q as an organisation. A very small amount about my role, and then I'm going to describe something which is conceptual at the moment, but it's about an identification service for plants, and I'm going to kind of outline how I think this might be achieved. So you can divide Q up into many, many different parts, but for the purposes of introduction, I thought I'd divide it into two. On the right here is a picture of the gardens itself. Q is a World Heritage Site, which partly is a reflection of the amazing biodiversity that's reflected in the gardens, but also of the culture and the heritage that is there. It's 250 years old this year, and incorporates a huge amount of history and culture for the UK and for the world. We have about 2 million visitors each year who come through the gates, both of Kew Gardens, and also we have a sister garden down in Sussex called Wakehurst Place. And it's one of the jewels in the UK's crown, if you like, in terms of its heritage and culture. The other side, on the left-hand side, which many people don't see when they come to the gardens, is Kew's science and conservation work. And actually, this is really the heart of Kew. What you see there is the Millennium Seed Bank, which is the largest ex-situ conservation project in the world. And there's almost 2 billion seeds stored in that facility there. Kew has over 200 scientists working in over 100 countries around the world. So there are people at any one point out doing projects on the ground, making the potential of plant science have an impact in the real world. So my role at Kew is very much to try and unlock some of that information and make it usable, and importantly make it have the potential to have real impact in the world. Kew's got a great history of innovation, and we managed to keep it quiet for almost 150 years, but Sir William Hooker, who was the first director of Kew as a public gardens, did actually have the very first laptop, which you can see right up there. There's a lot of other innovation that Kew's done. Rubber, for example, tea with sugar, gin and tonic, all of those could be traced back to innovation that Kew has done in the last 250 years. More recently, DNA sequencing of plants has been a very important area of growth. And in the future, I see this as being one of the areas that is going to have most potential impact. I'm not covering it at all in this talk, but the potential for DNA sequencing devices to become miniature is getting very close. And I think that that will be a very important tool in this area in the future. This is an example of something which I wanted to show you, and the reason is that I think it illustrates many of the things that have been talked about in the last couple of days. This is called the Great Plant Hunt, and it's a project that was funded by the Wellcome Trust, which is a big biomedical foundation in the UK. And they funded us to come up with a set of plant experiments that were very broadly inspired by Darwin, because 2009 was the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. And what we came up with is a Great Plant Hunt. We created 22,000 boxes of plant experiments, which looked like 17th century seafaring chests. And we distributed those, one to every state-funded elementary school in the UK. In those boxes was a whole set of experiments and activities for the kids to do, which enabled them to identify plants, to collect seeds from plants, and then to upload much of that information to a website which is basically a big citizen science repository. So this is a map you can see of all the schools that are taking part just in the London area. And we had almost 10,000 schools who signed up to take part in this project. So a huge number of, a huge degree of participation, and also a huge amount of data that was collected. And then these are some of the things that they did. So this is a picture of a fruiting daisy, which was one of the activities they had to do, was to identify the different phases of the life cycle of a daisy and to upload that information onto the website. We've also done a lot of research and development over the last couple of years with mobile devices in the gardens. This was a project that we did in collaboration with the BBC in the UK, and it was looking at how user-generated content could enhance somebody's visit to the gardens. But we've also done projects with schools using mobile technology and with GPS devices which can feed people information and video based on where they are within the gardens. And it's taught us a lot of things. I think the main thing for me is that the kind of received wisdom of Kew was that people came to Kew to get away from the rigours of daily life. And one of the things that they wanted to get away from was technology. But actually doing these experiments and these pilots, we've found that that's not true at all. And actually the technology can be have a real catalytic effect. And particularly in this project, we found that mixed generation groups, so parents and kids, for example, had an experience which was transformed. The younger generation mastered the technology very easily and quickly, and the older generation typically had more of an interest in the content. But together they had this experience which they wouldn't have achieved any other way. And one of the other things that we've learned from all of this is that people being able to identify plants is of real fundamental importance, both when they come to Kew, and at Kew there are labels on some of the plants, but more importantly when they're out in the outside world. The demand for this kind of service is huge, and we know this from our visitors, but also from research we've done on our website and elsewhere. And here are just a few of the kind of drivers for that demand. So everything from health, medicine, pharmaceuticals. If you can identify plants easily, you can unlock the potential of some of those medicinal effects and growing local versions of those plants. Right through to recreational users, so people who are out on a hike and want to know what something is, down to formal education, and I think really importantly this idea of biodiversity, custody and management, which I think governments are getting much more involved in. There's somewhere between 350,000 and 400,000 species of plant in the world. This is a diagram showing the genus of plants that have been found in Massachusetts, but just those beginning with A. It was just a little graphic to kind of illustrate the vast diversity and numbers that there are. And I suppose for any identification system, this means that there is a big scale to the challenge. Traditionally, there's a whole load of tools which have been used to identify plants. They're very specialist tools, and I'm going to show you a few examples in a minute. And hence they're quite inaccessible. They're not things that somebody walking down the street can pick up and use. So the typical starting point is a field guide. So this is an example of the palm trees of Madagascar, and somebody who's a botanist who's going out into the field would take one of these field guides and would use it to identify particular types of species of palm trees and to identify whether they found something that is actually a new species. And there's roughly 1,000 new species are described each year, new to science. So it's a real, it's a very interesting area to be in botany. It's somewhere where in your working career you're very likely to find a new species. Within the field guides, there are these things called dichotomous keys, which are basically a branching tree structure. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. And you answer a set of questions. Each question has a kind of binary set of 2 answers. And they're very accurate, but they have lots of problems, like the language is quite technical. And the biggest problem is that if you start at the top of the tree, and if you can't see any ovules, for example, on the specimen that you have, then you're stumped right from the beginning. There's nothing that you can do. Interactive keys have been developed using software over the last 20 years or so, and these are much more sophisticated, and they allow you to pick characteristics that you want to use in order to identify plants. But they're still very complicated, they're still not accessible, they're still not the kind of thing that people can pick up and use. And then this is what's called a type specimen. So we have somewhere above 7 million of these in the herbarium at Kew. This is actually one, I don't know whether you can read it, but this is one that was collected by Charles Darwin in 1835 from the Galapagos Islands. So just to illustrate some of the interesting bits of history we have in here, but this is the actual definitive specimen for this particular species. And if you wanted to check whether something that you collected was the same species as this one, then you'd actually have to come to Kew, find this particular type of specimen, and compare the two things visually. So what am I trying to get at? What I'm trying to get at is something which is very accessible. It's something that you can access from the point of need. So when you're standing there looking at something, you want to know what it is. You don't want to have to travel halfway across the world to Kew to do that. It also needs to be usable by a range of different audiences, both specialist and non-specialist. So it needs to have the usability and the language to be able to do that. And I think it's something that we're very keen on, that an identification service actually supports and catalyses learning and education. It's not just about a kind of one point of information. It's about how do you use that to then extend people's interest in learning. So essentially what we're looking at is something where you can use a cell phone to take a picture of a plant, and then through some kind of process you can get back an answer to what that particular species is. This is actually an invasive species which is causing a huge amount of problems in the UK. So there are various things which already exist, various methods which already exist to try and do this kind of thing. Image recognition is one which is in development as we speak, and there's a team collaboration between Smithsonian, Columbia, and University of Maryland, which is funded by the National Science Foundation, which is looking at leaf shape and being able to analyse leaf shape to provide at least a kind of checklist, a short list of possibilities of what a species might be. This is very early stages in this development, and there are obvious problems with this kind of thing. Firstly, plants don't have, or some plants don't have leaves all year round. And secondly, the leaves change depending on the point in the life cycle, and so being able to take all those things into account is complicated. There's a nice way of being able to provide these interactive keys which group characteristics together, and most people can pick out some quite simple characteristics of plants. Flower colour is the obvious one if the plant's flowering, but things like whether the stem is hollow and solid. So you can provide a relatively short number of questions which can get you to a pretty good short list of what the plant might be. And then using online communities, there was some discussion about this yesterday, particularly from Des. This is a project which is being run by the Open University in the UK, which Kew is collaborating with, called iSpot, and it's basically a social network for naturalists. So what it does is it encourages people to make observations in their back garden or in the park or when they're out on a hike, and to upload those observations to this network. They also have the opportunity to upload a theory about what they think it is, and then the network provides them with a confirmation of how the degree of certainty to which their result is correct or not. And this works on a number of levels. By participating and feeding back on somebody else's identification, you earn more points within the social network. So the more points you have, the larger, the more weight your identification carries. So this method will never necessarily provide an absolute 100% certainty of what that species is, but it can provide a very, very good degree of accuracy. Being able to see what a species is one very important thing, but the geographical data related to a species is also very, very important. Knowing where a species is and what time of the year it is can help provide a very, very quick shortlist about what the species could be. This is actually, I put this in partly because it's a device which we use at Kew. It's a GPS device, so it can feed information to people as they move around the gardens, which can cover the landscape, the architecture, but also the species that we have. And of course, all of these methods of trying to narrow down what a species might be rely on reference data sets. There's a huge number of these. I mean, Kew has its own data set, as do other botanic gardens like Missouri, for example. GBIF, which is an international organisation that pulls together all of the biodiversity information that's produced by places like Kew and Missouri, and then offers it out in a set of web services and other types of services to people like Encyclopedia of Life, who I'm sure you've heard of. The National Biodiversity Network is an organisation based in the UK which provides geographical-based checklists of species that have been surveyed in the UK. So I've taken the premise that a service such as this could be based on a cellular phone. Why have I done that? Well, some of the things that were discussed yesterday again, they're very portable, they have huge potential computing power. Their penetration in the marketplace is now such that, I mean, we had a show of hands yesterday, enough people have these kind of devices that it becomes a viable option to be able to present services on them. And they're very intuitive, they're just easy to use, they're easy to do things on, and they're very easy to make and distribute applications on as well. So let's unpack some of the things that we've just been talking about and see how those might work. The first thing is the GPS. Where are you and what time of year is it that you're looking at this plant? And the National Biodiversity Network in the UK already has a set of web services where you can plug in a long and lat location, and you can get this checklist of all the plants that have ever been found in that area. So very quickly, immediately, you can get a checklist of maybe 30 species of plant that it could be, depending on where you are. As we've already seen, the image recognition has a part to play in this. I think that that's going to develop considerably over the next few years. And I think in combination with some of these other things, it can be part of a service. Where I think it'll be used soonest is one other step in this process to narrow down what the species might be. So you have your initial checklist of, say, 30, and then you can narrow that down, maybe using image recognition, if that's available, to maybe half of those, or maybe slightly less. And then using a combination of these interactive keys. So once you know that it's within this particular checklist, you can then dynamically provide a set of characteristics which people can check off and get you down to maybe a couple of species. And in parallel with this, using the online communities in an intelligent way, this doesn't necessarily get you an immediate answer, but I think as the number of people taking part in these kind of communities grows, it will be more and more a viable option to providing these kind of services. So finally, you get to your identification. You know what the species is. But that is very much not the end point as we see it. In many ways, that you have then got the key to unlock the information about the species that you're looking at. So one of the very important feedback mechanisms I see is biodiversity maps. And there's lots of organisations that are beginning to create these and deliver these. The NBN in the UK being one of them. But being able to present this information geographically has huge potential value. And of course that can then feed right back into the starting point of the web services. Once you know that people have found and identified species at that particular point, that then becomes a useful piece of information for other people who are trying to identify plants in that area. The other thing that we have started to use at Kew is other methods of being able to identify plants. So Rich yesterday talked about RFID. We've actually started using these 2D matrix codes on some of our plant labels. So this is an example here. And people who have a matrix code reader can point their cellular phone at that code there, and that'll then take them to the species page that we have for the Chilean wine palm, which they'll be able to browse on their phone. So they can actually drill down immediately into a huge amount of information that Kew holds in its archives about that species. I've talked about these maps, but I really see the biodiversity management as a key part of this value chain. So being able to make this information available by providing these kind of services, I think has a huge amount of value for a range of different audiences. So, as I say, this is very conceptual. It's something that QE is actively working towards with partners, but I don't have a prototype of it to show you at the moment. But these are some of the reasons why I think that now is the right time to be actually trying to deliver something which can be used for people to enable people to identify plants, and to use that as a key into information about those species, but more importantly as a key into information which can help them transform the world around them. And I think that we're very close to achieving that. Thank you.